At the family wedding, my mom shoved me aside, "You don't belong in photos." But then the photographer. The words hung in the rose-scented air, a poison dart wrapped in silk. But the story didn't begin with the shove. It began, as it always did, with a flicker of hope, a fragile, stupid little bird I should have learned to cage decades ago. The wedding was an exercise in pastel perfection, a testament to my mother's iron will. The Thornton estate gardens weren't merely rented, they were conquered. Every rosebush seemed to have been personally interrogated by my mother, Carol, to ensure its blooms were the exact shade of blush pink she'd specified on her 50-page planning document. The string quartet wasn't just playing Vivaldi, they were playing the Vivaldi Carol had decreed was the most emotionally resonant for a late afternoon ceremony. Even the sun seemed to have been bullied into casting a soft, golden, cinematic glow over the proceedings. This was not a wedding, it was a meticulously curated exhibition of the family I was ostensibly a part of. I felt like a smudge on a watercolor painting. My dress, a deep emerald green silk that I loved, felt like a deliberate act of rebellion in a sea of champagne, lavender, and dusty rose. I'd chosen it because it made me feel like myself, a little dark, a little rich, a little out of place. Carol's eyes had swept over me when I arrived, a flicker of disdain so brief it was almost imperceptible to anyone else. But to me, it was a siren's wail. Wrong. You are wrong. Your color is wrong, your presence is wrong. I clutched a glass of lukewarm champagne, the bubbles doing little to lift my spirits. My sister, Chloe, the bride, the golden child, the sun around which our family's solar system revolved, was a vision in white lace and manufactured joy. Her smile was brilliant, but I could see the tension in her jaw. She kept glancing at our mother, a silent, constant check-in for approval. Am I doing this right, Mommy? Am I being the perfect bride you designed? Emma. My father's voice, soft and hesitant, pulled me from my thoughts. Robert was a man who had mastered the art of fading into the background. His hair was the color of faded newsprint, his suit a noncommittal gray. He had long ago learned that the path of least resistance was the only one that didn't lead directly into the path of Hurricane Carol. "Hi, Dad," I said, managing a small smile. "Chloe looks nice, doesn't she?" he murmured, his eyes fixed on a distant oak tree as if it held the secrets to the universe. He could never quite look at the thing that was causing the tension. "She looks beautiful," I agreed. "Like a princess," he nodded, taking a sip of his scotch. "Your mother has outdone herself." It was a statement of fact, devoid of warmth. An acknowledgement of a force of nature, like commenting on the tide. I watched as Carol swept through the crowd of guests, her posture ramrod straight, her smile a weapon of mass pleasantry. She adjusted a centerpiece, whispered something sharp to a waiter that made his shoulders slump, and then seamlessly turned to laugh, a tinkling, artificial sound, at a joke told by one of her wealthy friends. She was a conductor of appearances, and today was her magnum opus. The ceremony was a blur of memorized vows and polite applause. I sat in the second row, a deliberate placement to signal my status, close enough to be considered immediate family, far enough to be out of the splash zone of the primary emotional event. I saw Chloe's hand tremble as she placed the ring on her new husband's finger. I saw my mother dab a single, perfect tear from her eye with a lace-trimmed handkerchief, a gesture so perfectly cinematic I was sure she'd practiced it in a mirror. And then, it was time for the photos. The part of any family gathering I dreaded the most. Photos were not for capturing memories, in my family, they were for constructing a narrative. They were proof. Proof of our happiness, our unity, our flawless success. "Alright, let's get the family of the bride." The photographer's voice was cheerful and professional. He had a kind face, framed by a messy thatch of dark hair, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, seemed to see everything. He moved with an easy grace, his camera an extension of his body. His name was Alex, I'd overheard Carol saying, a supposed artistic genius she'd hired for an astronomical fee. The chosen location was in front of a grand stone archway dripping with ivory white wisteria. The perfect backdrop for the perfect family. My father shuffled into place. My mother glided to his side, her hand proprietary on his arm. Chloe and her new husband, Mark, stood in the center, radiant and beaming for the lens. There was a space. A person-sized gap between Chloe and my mother. My heart did its stupid, hopeful little flutter. It was a formal portrait. The immediate family. Surely, that included me. I was the sister of the bride, the daughter of the parents. On paper, my inclusion was non-negotiable. Chloe caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the empty space. It was a weak invitation, but it was an invitation nonetheless. Bolstered by that tiny crumb of validation, I took a breath and stepped forward. My heel sank slightly into the perfectly manicured lawn as I moved to stand beside my sister, ready to arrange my face into the familiar mask of pleasant belonging. I could feel the silk of her dress brush against my arm. For a single, fleeting second, I was in. I was part of the picture. That was when my mother's hand landed on my shoulder. Her fingers were like talons, digging into the muscle. Her smile, aimed at the photographer, didn't waver, but her face, turned slightly towards me, was a mask of cold fury. "Not you, Emma," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss that sliced through the gentle strains of the string quartet. I froze, the champagne in my stomach turning to acid. "What?" Her grip tightened, and then she physically shoved me. It wasn't a gentle push, not a subtle nudge. It was a blunt, forceful shove that made me stumble backward, my heel catching in the soft earth. I nearly fell. "This is for the real family," she continued, her voice still a low, vicious whisper meant only for me, but loud enough for the quiet man standing just a few feet away with a camera to his eye. "You don't belong in photos. You'll ruin the aesthetic. You'll ruin the aesthetic." The words echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of my mind. It wasn't that I was unwanted. It was that I was a visual flaw. A compositional error. My deep green dress, my artist's hands that still had a faint trace of charcoal under one nail, my face that held a little too much reality and not enough of her practiced placidity. I was a discordant note in her perfect symphony. I stared at her, my mouth half open, a protest dying on my lips. The public nature of the humiliation was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. A few of the nearby guests had seen it. I saw their eyes widen and then quickly skitter away, a flush of second-hand embarrassment on their faces. They were looking at the perfect floral arrangements, at the sky, at anything but the daughter who had just been physically ejected from her own family. I looked at my sister. Chloe was staring intently at a single petal on her bouquet, her face a carefully blank canvas. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She wouldn't defend me. The golden child never risked the sun's warmth. I looked at my father. He cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound, and adjusted his tie, his gaze fixed on that same distant oak tree. He had retreated to his safe place, a universe away from the unpleasantness. Their silence was the final twist of the knife. It wasn't just my mother's cruelty, it was their complicity. They were all custodians of the family myth, and I was the chapter they had all silently agreed to tear out. "Okay, big smiles everyone." Alex, the photographer, called out, his voice strained with a professionalism that felt heroic. My mother, her work done, turned back to the camera. The family closed the gap where I had stood, shuffling closer to erase the space I had occupied. Their bodies formed an impenetrable wall of belonging. Carol's smile was radiant now, triumphant. She had excised the blemish. The composition was perfect. The flash went off, a brilliant, blinding burst of light. It seared the image into my memory, the four of them, a portrait of familial bliss, and me, the ghost standing just outside the frame. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of a scene. My movements felt wooden, each step a monumental effort. The sound of the string quartet seemed to mock me, its cheerful melody a soundtrack to my utter desolation. I walked past the smiling guests, their faces blurring into a meaningless tapestry of polite society. I could feel their pity, their curiosity, like insects crawling on my skin. My destination was instinctual. I moved away from the light and laughter, towards the shadier, less manicured edges of the estate. I found a secluded corner, hidden behind a thick curtain of weeping willow branches. The air here was cooler, smelling of damp earth and moss. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where the curated perfection of the wedding couldn't reach. I leaned against the rough bark of the willow's trunk and slid down to the ground, my silk dress pooling around me. The carefully constructed dam I had built around my heart for years finally broke. The shove was just the final, brutal blow. It was the culmination of 1,000 smaller cuts, the forgotten birthdays, the backhanded compliments about my hobby of an art career, The family vacations I was only told about after they'd returned, tanned and smiling in photos I wasn't in. The tears came, hot and silent at first, then turning into ragged, guttural sobs that I muffled against my knees. I cried for the little girl who was always told to be quieter, to be less sensitive, to be more like Chloe. I cried for the teenager who had won the state art prize, only to have her mother dismiss it as a messy little distraction. I cried for the woman I was now, a 30-year-old orphan with living parents. The willow branches swayed gently, their long, green fronds dancing in the breeze. They created a private, dappled world, shielding me from view. I felt like a child again, hiding in a closet, waiting for the storm of my mother's anger to pass. But this time, the storm was inside me. A tempest of grief and a rage so profound it felt like it could split the world in two. I didn't know how long I sat there, lost in the tidal wave of my own sorrow. The sounds of the wedding became a distant murmur, a party happening on another planet. I pulled my knees to my chest, my forehead resting on them, trying to make myself as small as possible, as if I could simply fold myself out of existence. A sound, soft and close, startled me. The gentle click of a camera shutter. My head snapped up. Through the lacy curtain of willow leaves, I saw him. Alex, the photographer. He was standing about 20 feet away, his camera lowered now. He wasn't aiming it at me anymore, but it was clear what had just happened. He hadn't invaded my space or made a show of it. He'd seen a moment and captured it, the way a naturalist might photograph a rare, wounded animal in its hidden den. My first instinct was a hot flash of shame. He had seen me. He had seen me broken and sobbing, my mascara probably streaming down my face, my composure shattered. It was the exact state my mother had spent my entire life trying to prevent me from ever showing in public. He didn't move. His blue eyes weren't filled with pity, but with a quiet, intense focus. An understanding. He held my gaze for a long moment before he started walking towards me, his steps slow and deliberate, as if approaching a skittish deer. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and calm. "I didn't mean to intrude." I swiped at my wet cheeks with the back of my hand, trying to reclaim some shred of dignity. "It's fine," I croaked, my voice rough. "Just enjoying the scenery." A small, sad smile touched his lips. He stopped a respectful few feet away. "It is a beautiful tree." He didn't patronize me by pretending he hadn't seen exactly what happened. The honesty was disarming. He fiddled with the back of his camera for a moment, his fingers moving with practiced ease over the small buttons and dials. "Can I show you something?" I was wary, but I nodded. What more humiliation could I possibly endure? He crouched down, bringing himself to my level, and turned the small screen on the back of his camera towards me. The image that glowed there stole the air from my lungs all over again, but for a completely different reason. It was me. I was sitting just as I was, huddled against the trunk of the weeping willow. But it wasn't a picture of a pathetic, crying woman. It was something else entirely. He had framed the shot through the delicate, hanging leaves, so they created a soft, almost ethereal border. The light, filtering through the canopy, caught the silver tracks of tears on my cheeks, making them look like warriors' paint, not streaks of sorrow. My head was lifted, and my eyes, though red-rimmed and full of pain, were looking out from the shadows of the tree with a look of fierce, defiant clarity. He had captured the exact moment my grief was beginning to crystallize into rage. He hadn't captured my brokenness, he'd captured the precise moment I started to put myself back together. I couldn't find the word. "That's the truth," he finished for me, his voice soft but certain. "The only real photo I've taken all day." I stared at the image. I had spent my life being told I was a flaw, a blemish. I had just been physically removed from a photograph for that very reason. But this man, this stranger, had looked at me in my lowest, most vulnerable moment and seen art. He had seen strength. He had seen a story worth telling. He zoomed out on the screen and swiped to another photo. It was the one he'd taken just after the shove. The perfect family portrait. Under his critical, artistic eye, the flaws were glaring. My mother's smile was a brittle, triumphant rictus. My father's eyes were empty. My sister's radiance was dimmed by a visible layer of stress. The groom looked like a handsome prop. It was a photograph of 4 strangers standing uncomfortably close to one another. "Your mother is wrong," Alex said, his gaze meeting mine. There was a quiet anger in his eyes, a professional and personal disgust that acted as a balm on my raw wounds. That photo I just took of them? It's a lie. It's stiff, it's empty. It's a brochure for a country club. There's no life in it. No soul. He swiped back to the photo of me under the willow. This one is beautiful. It's honest. It's powerful. Hearing my own hidden strength articulated by someone else, an impartial observer, an artist, was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. The shame that had been burning in my gut began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning heat. It was anger, pure and clean and righteous. My mother had pushed me out of the frame, but Alex had just made me the entire subject. He had centered me. She lives for those lies, I said, my voice gaining a harder edge. Her whole life is one big, perfectly curated photograph. I know the type, he said with a nod, standing up and offering me a hand. I took it. His grip was firm and steady, and he pulled me to my feet with surprising ease. They're all about the surface. The aesthetic. They're terrified of what's underneath. He looked from me back towards the distant sounds of the reception. She cares about images, right? About the perfect story. More than anything, I confirmed. More than her own daughters. The words tasted like bile, but they were true. Alex turned back to me, and the look in his eyes was no longer just empathetic, it was conspiratorial. A spark of an idea was igniting there. I've been a wedding photographer for 10 years, he said. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. Bridesmaids trying to sabotage the bride, groomsmen getting into fistfights over old girlfriends, mothers-in-law who act like they're at a funeral. But I have never, ever seen a mother do that to her own child. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. It was cruel. It was theater. And she did it in front of me, in front of everyone, because she's so used to getting away with it. Because she believes she controls the narrative. The heat in my stomach was a bonfire now. He was right. She had never faced a consequence because my father, my sister, and I had been conditioned to absorb her cruelty and call it love. We edited her, softened her, made excuses for her, all to maintain the fragile peace. What if, Alex said, his voice dropping slightly, we told a different story? I stared at him. What do you mean? I have every photo from today. The good, the bad, the posed, and the candid. Hundreds of them. The raw files. They are my property until I deliver the final, edited gallery. He gestured with his camera. This thing doesn't just capture the smiles. It captures the grimaces in between. The anxious glances. The moments when the masks slip. I saw your mother talking to the caterer. I saw your father watching the exit during the vows. I saw your sister looking at your mother for approval a dozen times. He took a step closer, his blue eyes intense. She wants a perfect wedding album to show off to her friends. A testament to her perfect family. I have the power to give her that. Or I have the power to show her the truth. The one I saw through my lens. The full implication of what he was offering dawned on me, a slow, exhilarating sunrise of an idea. Vengeance. Not a screaming match, not a tearful confrontation, those were my mother's battlefields, and she always won. This would be different. This would be a battle of images, of narratives. It would be fought on her own terms, with her own chosen weapons. And for the first time in my life, I would have the upper hand. The hurt from the shove was still there, a deep, throbbing bruise on my soul. But it was no longer the only thing I felt. It was being overlaid with something new, something sharp and focused and dangerous. It was purpose. I looked from Alex's determined face down to the glowing screen of his camera, at the image of the woman under the willow tree. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor. She was a warrior. She was the protagonist of a story that was just beginning. A slow smile spread across my face, pulling at lips that were still stiff from crying. It probably looked strange, a little unhinged, but it was the most genuine smile I had produced all day. It felt like coming home to myself. Tell me more, I said. The 2 days following the wedding were a strange, suspended limbo. The raw, open wound of my mother's shove had begun to scar over, but beneath the surface, a new kind of energy was building. It wasn't the familiar, dull ache of familial disappointment. It was a sharp, humming frequency, a current of purpose that vibrated under my skin. The hope I had carried for so long, that fragile, stupid bird, was dead. And in its place, a phoenix was stirring, its talons forged in righteous anger. Alex had given me his card, a simple piece of black cardstock with his name and number in a stark white font. He'd simply said, "When you're ready to develop the film, so to speak." The choice was mine. I could let the incident fade, another painful anecdote to be buried in the family cemetery of unspoken truths. Or I could step into the darkroom with him and see what emerged. On the third day, I made the call. His studio was in a part of the city my mother would have described as having character, her tone implying it was a character of dubious morals. It was a renovated warehouse district, all exposed brick, graffiti murals, and the distant rumble of a freight train. The air smelled of roasted coffee and diesel fumes, a stark contrast to the sterile, rose-scented atmosphere of my parents' suburban world. I found his address above a small, independent bookstore, up a flight of creaking wooden stairs. The door to his studio was heavy, industrial steel. When I pushed it open, I stepped out of my world and completely into his. The space was cavernous, a single enormous room with ceilings that soared 20 feet high, crisscrossed with old wooden beams. Sunlight streamed in from a wall of massive, multi-paned windows that were probably as old as the building itself. But the light didn't create the same sterile perfection as it had at the wedding. Here, it was a working light, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, highlighting the texture of the worn floorboards, and casting long, dramatic shadows. The scent hit me first, a complex, chemical perfume of developer and fixer from the darkroom I could see sectioned off in one corner, mingling with the smell of old paper, hot electronics, and strong black coffee. It was the smell of creation. One entire brick wall was a massive corkboard, covered in a chaotic, beautiful collage of images. There were stark black and white portraits of old men with faces like roadmaps, vibrant shots of street festivals, abstract close-ups of peeling paint and rusted metal. These were not the polished, smiling photos my mother valued. These were photos with soul, photos that told stories of struggle, joy, and time itself. This was a place where truth was revered, not hidden. Alex was standing in the center of the room, in front of a massive computer monitor, his back to me. He was so absorbed in his work he hadn't heard me enter. A low, moody jazz saxophone melody drifted from a pair of speakers. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, a stark contrast to the suit he'd worn at the wedding. This was him in his natural habitat. "Hi," I said, my voice feeling small in the vast space. He turned, and a slow smile spread across his face when he saw me. It was a genuine smile, warm and welcoming. "Emma. I was hoping you'd come." He gestured to a worn leather armchair near the windows. "Coffee? I just made a fresh pot. It's strong enough to dissolve a spoon." "Please," I said, sinking into the chair. It was the most comfortable piece of furniture I had ever sat on. He brought over a heavy ceramic mug filled with steaming, dark liquid. "So," he said, pulling up a stool to sit opposite me. "The reveal party." "Brunch," I corrected him. "My mother doesn't do anything as common as a party. It's a brunch or a soiree or a gathering. And yes, it's in 2 weeks. A Saturday." "Perfect," he said, his eyes gleaming with the intensity I'd seen under the willow tree. "That gives us time to build our case." He leaned forward, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Here's my thought. A Trojan horse. I deliver 2 products. First, the official story. It'll be a beautiful, password-protected online gallery with a couple hundred meticulously edited photos. All the smiles, all the perfect moments, all the lies. That's for your sister and her husband. It's what they paid for, and it will keep them from suspecting a thing. They'll be happy. They get their fairy tale." He took a sip of his coffee. "But for the brunch, your mother isn't going to just pass around a laptop. She wants a performance. She wants to be the grand presenter of her own success. So we give her one. We'll call it the director's cut. A slideshow, a narrative experience. We'll start it off perfectly, lull her and her sycophants into a state of smug bliss. And then, we pivot." The word hung in the air between us. Pivot. It was such a simple, elegant word for such a devastating act of sabotage. how do we pivot? I asked, my heart starting to beat faster. With the truth, he said simply. We use her own obsession against her. We build a story so compelling, so visually undeniable, that it shatters her carefully constructed reality right in front of her audience. But to do that, I need more than just the wedding photos. I need the backstory. I need the evidence. That was my cue. The part of the plan that only I could provide. For the next hour, we talked. I told him everything. I sketched out the family dynamics, my mother, the narcissist queen, my father, the silent, enabling consort, my sister, the princess trapped in the tower of approval. I told him about my art, how it was a language my family refused to learn. I told him about the lifetime of subtle exclusions and overt dismissals. He listened, not with pity, but with the focused attention of a journalist gathering facts for an exposé. He nodded, asked clarifying questions, and took notes in a small black book. Okay, he said finally, closing the notebook. I have the psychological framework. Now, we need the visual proof. The wedding was the climax, but every story needs a first act. You need to go digging, Emma. Find me the photos that show the pattern. The ones that prove this wasn't a one-time thing. Leaving his studio felt like stepping out of a war room. The city air felt charged with possibility. For the first time, my past wasn't just a heavy burden to be dragged behind me, it was an arsenal. My apartment, a small one-bedroom I adored, felt like a haven after the visit to Alex's studio. It was the antithesis of my mother's house. Her home was a museum of beige and cream, a place of silent, expensive objects and zero personality. Mine was a riot of color and controlled chaos. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against the walls, my own personal stories told in oil and acrylic. Books were stacked on every available surface. It was a space that was lived in, a space that was mine. The evidence was stored in the back of my closet, in a collection of heavy, full-leather photo albums and dusty cardboard boxes. The archives of a life I'd tried to forget I'd lived. I pulled them out, one by one. The air filled with the musty smell of aging paper and forgotten memories. I sat on the floor, cross-legged, and began the painful, necessary archaeology of my own life. The first album was bound in baby pink leather, the words "Chloe's first year" embossed in gold. I flipped through it. Dozens of photos of my older sister as a cherubic baby, cooing in our mother's arms, smiling in our father's lap. I wasn't born yet. It was a document of the perfect, two-child family they had before I arrived and complicated the picture. The next album was for me. Emma's first year. It was thinner. The photos felt more obligatory. Carol's smile was a little tighter. My father looked a little more tired. I moved on, box by box, year by year. And the pattern Alex had spoken of began to emerge, stark and undeniable. It was a masterclass in systematic exclusion. I found the first piece of key evidence in a box marked Birthdays 1995 to 2000. It was my 7th birthday party. The photo was a wide shot of the living room. In the center, a 5-year-old Chloe was gleefully tearing the wrapping paper off a gigantic Barbie dream house, a gift that wasn't even for her. A crowd of other children and smiling parents were gathered around her, their attention a magnetic field. And there I was, on the far right edge of the frame, half out of the shot. I was sitting on the floor alone, my back against the wall, holding a small, already opened book. My party hat was askew, and the look on my face was one of complete and utter resignation. I remembered that day. My mother had said, "Oh, let Chloe open a few, Emma. You know how she loves presents. Don't be selfish, darling." I carefully removed the photo and placed it on a clean white sheet of paper on my floor. Exhibit A. Next came a box of loose photos from high school. I found it almost immediately, my graduation picture. It wasn't the formal portrait, but the candid shot taken right after the ceremony. My parents, Chloe, and I were standing together. My father had his arm around Chloe. My mother had her arm around Chloe. I was standing slightly apart, on the edge of the group, with a visible gap of air between my shoulder and my father's. In the version my mother had framed and hung in her hallway, she had literally cropped me out, creating a perfect portrait of a 3-person family celebrating their daughter's success. I had the original. I placed it next to the birthday photo. Exhibit B. The most painful piece of evidence was one I had to find on my own laptop. It was from 3 years ago, the night of my first solo gallery show. It had been a huge moment for me, the culmination of years of work, struggle, and ramen noodle dinners. I had poured my heart and soul onto those canvases. I had invited my family weeks in advance. My mother had sniffed and said, "Oh, I don't know, Emma. It's a Thursday. And that part of town is so gritty." They didn't come. I had asked a friend to take a picture of me. In it, I'm standing next to my largest painting, a piece titled Family Portrait, with negative space. It was an abstract depiction of 4 figures, with one of them rendered only as a hollow, empty outline. I was smiling in the photo, but it was a brittle, lonely smile. The space beside me, where my family should have been, was a gaping void. I printed it out in high resolution and laid it with the others. Exhibit C. The proof that my exclusion wasn't just social, it was professional and personal. They hadn't just refused to be in a picture with me, they had refused to bear witness to my life. I spent the rest of the evening scanning the photos, creating a digital folder of my life as the family footnote. Each image was a fresh stab of pain, but with each one, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. This was about reclaiming my entire history. The next day, I went back to Alex's studio with a USB drive clutched in my hand like a talisman. He was waiting for me. We spent hours at his massive workstation, my archival photos displayed next to the wedding shots he had begun to sort. His process was mesmerizing. He was no longer just a photographer, he was a forensic analyst, a storyteller. He showed me things I hadn't even noticed in the chaos of the wedding day. "Look at this," he said, pulling up a photo taken during the cocktail hour. It was a shot of my mother speaking to the head caterer. To a casual observer, she looked elegant and in charge. Alex zoomed in. He pointed to the caterer's face, which was pale, his expression tight with stress. He pointed to my mother's hand, which was gripping a champagne flute so tightly her knuckles were white. Her smile was a terrifying, mirthless slash. "This isn't a hostess," Alex murmured, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "This is a dictator." He flagged the photo, placing it in a folder he'd labeled the director's cut. He pulled up another. A wide shot of the guests seated for the ceremony. He scanned across the faces, then zeroed in on my father. Robert was sitting in the front row, and while everyone else was looking forward at the altar, he was turned ever so slightly, his gaze directed towards the side exit. His face was a mask of profound, weary resignation. He looked like a man calculating the distance to freedom. "And there's the enabler," Alex said softly. He didn't have to ask, he just knew. He edited the photo on the fly, not changing the content, but enhancing its truth. He deepened the shadows around my father, slightly desaturating the colors of the joyful guests around him, making him an island of gray melancholy in a sea of pastel. The effect was staggering. He had visually isolated him, just as he had isolated himself emotionally. He did the same with a photo of Chloe. It was taken right before she walked down the aisle. My mother was adjusting her veil. It should have been a tender mother-daughter moment, but Alex had caught the split second before the official smile. Carol's grip on Chloe's arm was possessive, her fingers digging into the delicate lace. Chloe's eyes were wide with a kind of panicked anxiety, her gaze fixed on our mother's face, desperate for that final stamp of approval. Alex sharpened the focus on their hands, on Chloe's terrified eyes. He transformed a seemingly perfect moment into a portrait of coercive control. We worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of righteous purpose. We were co-conspirators, artists creating our masterpiece of revenge. We laid out the narrative, piece by painful piece. We would storyboard the entire slideshow. Alex pulled over a large, rolling whiteboard. "Okay," he said, uncapping a black marker. "Act 1, the facade." He started sketching it out. The slideshow would begin with a 3-minute montage of pure, unadulterated wedding propaganda. The most beautiful, flawless shots Alex had taken. The close-up of the rings on a rose petal. The romantic, backlit photo of Chloe and Mark kissing. The sweeping vista of the estate. All set to the elegant, soaring strings of Vivaldi, the very music my mother had chosen. "We need to lull her," Alex explained, his marker flying across the board. We need to inflate her ego so much that the pop is deafening. We want her friends turning to her, whispering, "Oh, Carol, it's just divine." "She'll love that," I said, a bitter taste in my mouth. "Exactly," he said. "And then?" Act 2, The Crack. He drew a sharp, jagged line across the whiteboard. "The music will scratch to a halt. A sound effect, like a needle being dragged across a record. The screen will go black for 2 seconds. Total silence. The audience will be confused. They'll think it's a technical glitch." His eyes were alight with creative fire. "And then, the perfect family photo appears. The 4 of them. Let it hang there for 5 seconds. Then, we rewind it. In slow motion. We watch you get pushed out of the frame. And I have the audio. My camera was recording video at that point. I can isolate it. We'll hear her voice, amplified in the silence. You don't belong in photos. You'll ruin the aesthetic." A shiver went down my spine. It was brutal. It was perfect. "And finally," he said, drawing a new box, Act 3, The Truth. This is where we deconstruct the entire myth. The music comes back, but it's something else. Something somber, evocative. A single cello, maybe. And we start the juxtaposition. He began to draw lines and arrows, connecting my archival photos to his wedding shots. "We show the glossy photo of your mother and Chloe. Then, flash to the birthday party photo, with you on the sidelines. We show your beaming father walking Chloe down the aisle. Then, flash to the graduation photo where he's ignoring you. We show a wide shot of the happy family at the reception. Then, flash to my candid of your father staring at the exit." We cut back and forth, faster and faster, a relentless barrage of truth and lies, past and present, weaving together into one undeniable narrative of your exclusion. He paused, looking at me to see if I was still with him. I was. I was utterly captivated by the savage beauty of his plan. "The climax," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The slideshow will end. The music will fade. And 2 final images will appear. First, a new photo I'll create. A black and white version of the family portrait, but I'll digitally remove them, leaving only the empty space where you should have been. A ghost of a daughter." We let that hang in the silence for a long, uncomfortable 10 seconds. He looked at me, his expression softening. "And then, that image will slowly fade, and in its place, the final photograph will appear. The one I took of you. Under the willow tree. In full, glorious color. We hold on that. Your face. Your strength. Your truth. And that's it. The end." The lights come up. We were both quiet for a long moment, the entire, devastating presentation laid out before us on the whiteboard. It was more than just revenge. It was a manifesto. An artistic declaration of my own existence. The final piece of the puzzle was to bait the trap. The following afternoon, Alex made the call. I sat beside him, listening to his side of the conversation, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Carol, hello. Alex here," he said, his voice suddenly smooth and charming. "I'm just calling because I've been going through the photos from the wedding, and I am just blown away. Truly. The aesthetic you created was a dream to shoot." I had to cover my mouth to keep from laughing. He was using her own word against her. "Yes, absolutely," he continued, winking at me. "In fact, I was so inspired that I put together something a little special. Rather than just a standard gallery, I've created a short, artistic film. A modern, narrative-driven experience that really tells the story of the day. It's quite powerful." There was a pause. I could practically hear my mother preening on the other end of the line. Artistic. Narrative-driven. Powerful. It was catnip to her ego. "Well, that's what I was thinking," Alex said, his voice full of fake excitement. "Your brunch would be the absolute perfect venue for a premiere, if you will. A debut for your discerning friends. It would be my honor to present it for you personally." He listened for another moment, then smiled, a slow, predatory smile. "Wonderful. I'm so glad you agree. I promise you, Carol, it will be a presentation that no one will ever forget. He hung up the phone. The silence in the studio was electric. He turned to me. The trap, he said, is set. The day of the brunch dawned bright and cruelly beautiful. A perfect, cloudless Saturday, the kind of day my mother would believe she had personally arranged with the heavens. I stood before the full-length mirror in my apartment, not with the familiar dread that usually preceded a family event, but with the calm, focused resolve of a soldier dressing for a battle she knew she was going to win. There was no emerald green today. That was the color of quiet rebellion, of a daughter trying to carve out her own space. Today was about claiming the entire canvas. I chose a dress of the most striking, unapologetic crimson. It was a simple, elegant sheath, but the color was a declaration. It was the color of anger, of passion, of life. It was the color of a stop sign. In my mother's world of muted pastels and polite beiges, I would be an unignorable slash of red. I wore my hair down, letting it fall in its natural waves, and my makeup was minimal, save for a bold red lip that matched the dress. I was not hiding. I was not trying to blend in. I was the subject of the portrait now. As I drove towards the suburbs, towards the house that had always felt more like a museum than a home, I felt a strange detachment. The fear was gone. The desperate need for approval had been cauterized and cut away. I was no longer a participant in their drama. I was an observer, and narrator about to deliver the final, devastating chapter. The house was exactly as I remembered, a large, pristine colonial with an impossibly green lawn and symmetrical boxwood hedges that looked as though they were trimmed with nail scissors. Cars lined the quiet, tree-lined street, Mercedes, BMWs, a Porsche. Carol's friends, the ladies who brunch, had assembled. They were the arbiters of social standing, the jury of her peers before whom she constantly performed. Today, they were about to see a command performance, just not the one they were expecting. I parked a block away and walked, the click of my heels on the pavement a steady, rhythmic drumbeat counting down to detonation. I took a deep breath before I reached the front door, which was, of course, slightly ajar in a gesture of contrived welcome. I didn't knock. I walked in. The scene was a tableau of suburban affluence. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and catered quiche. About 20 women, all dressed in tasteful shades of cream and taupe, stood in small clusters around the cavernous living room, sipping champagne from delicate flutes. Their laughter was a light, tinkling sound, carefully modulated so as not to seem boisterous. My mother, Carol, was the center of it all, a queen holding court. She was wearing a winter white pantsuit, looking regal and untouchable. She saw me the moment I stepped into the room. Her perfectly curated smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her eyes swept over my crimson dress, and I saw a flicker of her signature disdain. I was a splash of vulgar color in her pristine white world. But beneath the disdain, there was something else, a flicker of confusion, maybe even unease. I wasn't behaving correctly. The black sheep wasn't supposed to walk into the fold looking this confident, this serene. I was supposed to arrive apologetic, or sullen, or not at all. Emma, she said, her voice a little too bright. What a surprise. Hello, Mother, I replied, my tone even and calm. I walked further into the room, and a few of her friends turned to look at me, their polite smiles freezing on their faces. I could hear the silent questions in the air. This is the other daughter? The artistic one? We were just talking about Chloe's beautiful wedding, Carol said, smoothly trying to regain control of the narrative, to place me back in my box. It was simply perfect. It was certainly memorable, I said, letting the words hang in the air with just enough ambiguity to be unsettling. I took a glass of water from a passing waiter, my hand perfectly steady. I saw my father, Robert, hovering near the French doors that led to the patio. He was holding a glass of scotch like it was a life raft. He saw me, and his eyes widened slightly before he quickly looked away, finding something fascinating in the pattern of the Persian rug. My sister, Chloe, was not there. She and Mark were on their honeymoon in Bali, blissfully unaware of the reckoning that was about to unfold. It was for the best. This wasn't about her. This was about me and the woman who had created me, then tried to erase me. A few minutes later, Alex arrived. He was the epitome of professional cool, dressed in a sharp black suit, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. He moved with an easy confidence that immediately commanded a quiet respect from the room. "Alex. So wonderful you could make it," my mother gushed, gliding over to him. This was her prize, her pet artist. "Carol," he said, shaking her hand. His eyes met mine for a fleeting second over her shoulder, a silent, steadying glance. "Showtime. Is everything ready for your premiere?" she asked, her voice dripping with self-importance. "Everything is ready," he confirmed. "I just need a blank wall and a few minutes to set up the projector. I promise, it's a presentation you and your guests won't soon forget." He delivered the line with such sincerity that my mother practically glowed with pride. She clapped her hands together, a sharp, commanding sound that silenced the polite chatter. "Everyone! Everyone! If I could have your attention, please." The women turned towards her, their faces expectant. Our wonderfully talented photographer, Alex, who was the genius behind Chloe's wedding photos, has prepared a very special artistic presentation for us today. A debut of his work. So if you'll all find a seat, the show is about to begin. There was a murmur of excited anticipation as the guests settled onto the plush, cream-colored sofas and chairs. My mother took the seat of honor, a wingback chair positioned for the perfect viewing angle. I chose a small armchair on the periphery of the group, a position that gave me a clear view of both the screen and my mother's face. My father, looking deeply uncomfortable, stood near the back of the room, as if to ensure a quick escape. Alex worked quickly, setting up a small, powerful projector on the coffee table. The wall above the unlit fireplace became a blank white screen. He dimmed the lights with a remote, and the room was cast into an intimate twilight. The only light came from the projector's beam, cutting a path through the dusty air. A hush fell over the room. The show began. The first notes of Vivaldi's Spring filled the silence, elegant and soaring. The first image faded into view, a breathtaking, romantic shot of Chloe and Mark, silhouetted against the setting sun. A collective, soft awe rippled through the audience. The montage of Act 1, the facade, played out exactly as we'd planned. It was a masterclass in wedding photography. A close-up of the intertwined rings on a pristine rose. A joyful shot of Chloe laughing as she tossed the bouquet. A candid of the flower girl with petals in her hair. Every image was perfect, every emotion seemingly genuine. I watched my mother. She was radiant, leaning forward in her chair, a proprietary smile on her face. This was her creation, her success story being broadcast in glorious high definition. She glanced at her friend Barbara next to her and preened as the woman whispered, "Carol, it's just divine." It was word for word what Alex had predicted. She was absorbing the validation, her ego inflating like a hot air balloon. She was completely, blissfully unaware of the sharp pin that was heading straight for her. The music swelled to a crescendo as the final image of the montage appeared, a wide shot of the happy couple walking back down the aisle, showered in confetti. The screen held on them for a moment, and then, the image faded to black. The music didn't fade with it. It scratched to a halt. A harsh, ugly sound, like a needle being dragged violently across a vinyl record. A confused murmur went through the room. My mother frowned, her perfect hostess mask slipping. "Is there a problem with the..." Before she could finish, the screen flickered back to life. In total, deafening silence, the perfect family photo appeared. The four of them, Carol, Robert, Chloe, and Mark, posed in front of the wisteria-covered arch. It hung there, a monument to a lie. I could feel the tension in the room. This was not part of the beautiful montage. This felt stark. Then, the image began to move. It rewound in eerie slow motion. My mother's triumphant smile receded. My father's blank expression shifted. And from the side of the frame, my own form appeared, stepping into the empty space. I watched myself on the screen, a ghost reinserting herself into the narrative. The room was dead silent. I could hear someone's shallow breathing. Then came the hand. My mother's hand, in slow motion, landing on my shoulder. The shove. The stumble. My exit from the frame. The action on screen froze at the moment of my deepest humiliation, and then, the audio kicked in. It was amplified, crystal clear in the silent room. My mother's voice, a vicious, sibilant whisper, echoed off the high ceilings. "Not you, Emma. This is for the real family. You don't belong in photos. You'll ruin the aesthetic. A collective, audible gasp swept through the room. It wasn't a polite sound, it was a sharp, shocked intake of breath. Several women turned to stare, open-mouthed, at my mother. Her face, illuminated by the projector's glow, had turned the color of ash. Her mouth was a thin, bloodless line. The balloon of her ego hadn't just been popped, it had been vaporized. The screen went black again for a single, brutal second. Then, Act 3 began. A single, mournful cello note filled the silence. The music was haunting, sorrowful, a world away from Vivaldi's cheerful strings. The deconstruction had begun. The first image was a glossy, perfect shot from the wedding of Carol adjusting Chloe's veil, the picture of motherly devotion. It stayed on screen for 3 seconds, then was replaced by a flash of Exhibit A, my 7th birthday party. Me, alone, on the edge of the frame, while my mother beamed at Chloe opening my presents. The whiplash was palpable. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Next, a beautiful photo of my father, looking proud as he walked Chloe down the aisle. Flash. It was replaced by Exhibit B, my high school graduation, with the visible, awkward gap between me and the rest of the family. The original, uncropped truth. Another image from the wedding, the whole family laughing at a toast. Flash. Alex's candid of my father, staring at the exit, his face a mask of misery. The juxtapositions came faster and faster. A shot of Carol embracing a guest was followed by the photo of her tyrannizing the caterer. A picture of Chloe smiling lovingly at our mother was followed by Alex's shot of her terrified eyes just before the ceremony. My archival evidence was interwoven with Alex's forensic captures from the wedding day, creating a relentless, undeniable narrative. It wasn't just a slideshow, it was an indictment. A visual prosecution. The whispers started. Low and venomous. I could pick out fragments. Never knew she had another daughter. My God, did you hear what she said? That poor girl. Carol always seemed so perfect. I watched my mother. She was frozen in her chair, a statue of horrified disbelief. Her mask of perfect composure had been shattered into a million pieces, and what lay beneath was ugly and exposed. Her eyes were wide, darting back and forth between the screen and the faces of her friends, her jury. But there was no sympathy there. Only shock and a rapidly dawning judgment. Her social currency was going up in flames. The montage reached its crescendo. The cello music swelled and then abruptly cut off, plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. The final sequence began. On the screen, a black and white image slowly faded in. It was the family portrait, but it was horrifyingly wrong. Alex had masterfully edited it. Chloe, Mark, Robert, and Carol were ghostly, transparent figures. The only thing in sharp focus was the empty space where I should have been. It was an image of an absence, a portrait of a haunting. It hung there in the silence for 10 long, excruciating seconds. The message was clear, this is what they tried to do. They tried to turn me into a ghost. Then, the ghostly image began to fade out, and a new one began to fade in. It was the photo Alex had taken of me under the weeping willow. The effect was breathtaking. After the cold black and white, the sudden appearance of vibrant color was a shock to the system. The deep, rich green of the willow leaves. The defiant crimson of my dress. And my face. Illuminated by that soft, dappled light, the tear tracks on my cheeks looked less like signs of weakness and more like tribal markings of survival. My eyes, though swollen, were clear and direct, staring out from the screen with a quiet, unbreakable strength. The portrait held, filling the entire wall. It was the final, irrefutable statement. After an entire presentation documenting my erasure, my image was the last one standing. After a lifetime of being told I didn't belong in photos, my photo was the one that would be seared into the memory of everyone in that room. The black sheep wasn't just in the picture, she was the picture. The projector clicked off. The lights in the room slowly came back up to their normal, gentle glow. The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever experienced. It was thick with shame, judgment, and the smoldering ruins of my mother's reputation. No one moved. No one spoke. I rose from my chair. The rustle of my dress was the only sound. All eyes in the room turned to me. I didn't look at her friends. I looked directly at my mother. She was still sitting in her chair, but she seemed to have shrunk. The regal posture was gone. She looked old, and small, and utterly defeated. Our eyes met, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her gaze besides criticism or indifference. I saw fear. She was afraid of me. My father was pressed against the back wall as if trying to merge with the wallpaper. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the floor, a portrait of lifelong cowardice. My revenge was complete. But I felt no triumphant glee, no ecstatic joy. Just a vast, quiet, and profound sense of release. The heavy chains of my past, the constant, grinding weight of seeking their approval, had been vaporized in that 10-minute slideshow. I was free. I had considered what I would say in this moment. A scathing remark? A final, cutting question? But looking at the wreckage, I knew words were unnecessary. The images had said it all. My silence was more powerful than any speech I could ever make. I walked across the room, my crimson dress a moving wound in the pale landscape of my mother's life. I saw one of her friends, Barbara, discreetly gathering her purse, her eyes avoiding mine. The exodus was about to begin. The social death sentence had been passed. My path took me past my father. I paused for a moment. He flinched but still didn't look up. I didn't say a word. I just stood there for a beat, letting my presence be a final judgment on his decades of silent complicity. Then I moved on. My final act was not for them, but for myself. In a strange way, the slideshow had also been about my sister. It had exposed the toxic system that had created both the golden child and the black sheep. Chloe wasn't there, but in that moment, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but was perhaps a kind of pitying understanding. I knew she would hear about this. The fallout would be immense. For a moment, I considered leaving a note, or sending a text, but I decided against it. My story with her was a different chapter, one that might or might not ever be written. My war with my mother was over. Alex was already packing up his equipment, his movements efficient and quiet. He was a professional who had completed a job. But as I approached, he looked up, and his eyes were full of a deep, quiet respect. He had been more than a co-conspirator, he had been my witness. He had given me the lens through which to reclaim my own story. I think my work here is done, he said, his voice low. You have no idea, I replied, a small, genuine smile finally touching my lips. Together, we walked towards the front door. We didn't look back. The sounds of a collapsing social order were just beginning to stir behind us, a few scraped chairs, a nervous cough. The postmortem was about to begin, but I had no interest in attending. We stepped out of the house and into the brilliant, unforgiving sunlight. The air felt clean and new. As I walked away from the pristine colonial prison of my childhood, leaving the shambles of my mother's reputation scattered on the cream-colored carpet behind me, I felt a lightness I had never known. I was not the outcast shoved aside. I was not the flaw in the aesthetic. I was the artist. And I had just painted my masterpiece.